baby boomers.
I used to be with it.
Millennials.
Okay, boomer.
Generation X.
What's going on?
And Gen Z. What do they have in common? Not a lot, it turns out. But one thing they can agree on is that this is the political podcast they want to listen to. Welcome to Not My Generation, the political podcast that looks at political events, news, and happenings across the world and at home through a generational lens. Your hosts are Dr. Emily Stacy and Professor James Davenport, two political scientists from Rose State College. But the views expressed on this program are solely the views of the host and their guests and do not reflect the views of Rose State College, its administration, faculty, or students. Coming up on today's program.
It's easier always to blame everything on Mexico. Why is Mexico letting all these migrants come in? Why is Mexico letting all these drugs come in? Because you are a huge market. After the election, the presidential election back in November, we have seen a very important increase in the demand of people who are wanting to register their children as Mexican nationals. Demographics show that Americans are not having enough children to continue growing. So you're gonna need these migrants. I honestly believe that very soon the largest economies in the world are gonna start fighting over these migrants.
And now, here are James and Emily. Good afternoon, Emily.
Good afternoon, James.
We are recording a very special podcast episode of Not My Generation. We are actually at the Mexican Consulate in Oklahoma City. You want to tell our listeners what all we're going to be talking about and who we're going to be visiting with today?
Yes, we're very excited to be here at the Mexican Consulate in Oklahoma City. Help me pronounce your name.
Edurne.
Oh, I am a native Oklahoman. That is a very...
Sorry, the R.
We can't, the R's. I'm very glad that you made time for us today in your capacity at the consulate. It's really important that folks understand really the relationship between Oklahoma and Mexico specifically. I think it's been shocking for my students to kind of hear about the tariffs, and I know I'm kind of jumping into things, but to kind of hear about the direct impacts of different policies and politics on Oklahoma and on specific neighborhoods. And we sort of dealt with this, about almost a decade ago with the Iran deal, right, with the nuclear agreement that was made. A lot of my students couldn't see how a nuclear agreement with Iran 5,000 miles away was going to impact the state of Oklahoma's economy. And of course, it absolutely did in terms of oil being released back onto the market and impacted our oil and gas economy incredibly. So we wanted to make sure that we got in touch with the right folks. And I believe that you are the right folks to speak with about potential impacts to not just the United States, but to the state of Oklahoma in sort of regards to economic policies that have been fluted in the recent months. So we're very excited to have you on today. Please pronounce your name one more time for me.
Sure. Sorry about the R.
No, please don't apologize.
Edurne. I actually, when I go to Starbucks here in the US, I use Anna, which is my daughter's name, because nobody understands my name. So I feel for you. Thank you. No, thank you, Dr. Stacy. It is a privilege to be a part of this podcast. Thank you so much to you, Mr. Davenport, for the visit here to Su Casa, the Consulate of Mexico in Oklahoma City. And I really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you for this conversation.
Well, we are very excited to get to visit with you and learn more about the consulate in general, what your mission is here, as well as delve into some of these specific policies that we've mentioned that seem to be coming out of the Trump administration and how that might impact Oklahoma as well as Mexico as well in the relationship between the two.
Okay, so if you could just briefly describe the mission of the consulate, when was it established, and your role specifically, give us the history. What are the goals and the mission of the consulate, and what's been accomplished so far?
Oh, sure. I'm going to read briefly a couple of notes I have here. Again, I am the Consul of Mexico in Oklahoma. I moved here back in December of 2022 from Dallas, where I was working there at the Mexican Consulate in Dallas to begin the process of opening this consulate, which started its operations in May 2023. We are the 52nd Mexican consulate in a network of 53 consular offices in the U.S., forming the largest consular network that one country has in another. This responds, of course, to the historically strong migratory flows of Mexican workers due to the demand of the U.S. labor market, who have settled here over generations and today number around 40 million people as an ethnic group in the U.S. In the particular case of Oklahoma, there are about 400,000 people of Mexican origin, out of which around 63,000 lack regular documentation. This migration is also reflected in Mexico, where about 1.7 million U.S. citizens reside today. This population previously consisted of retirees and minors born in the U.S. who returned to Mexico with their parents. But today, a third group has been incorporated, U.S. professionals who telework and choose Mexican cities as their new home.
Interesting.
That's fascinating. We need to learn more about that. I had not been aware of that development in that kind of flow, but it speaks to the technology and the ability of technology to allow people to transcend borders, so to speak, and choose wherever they want to live and work wherever they want to work.
Yeah, this especially happened after COVID, of course. And sometimes I make the joke that Mexican, especially people living in Mexico City and some towns, we love Americans, but some people have begun protesting because rents are going up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, sure. Because, they make their salaries in dollars, when Mexicans don't. We make our salaries in pesos. But that's how impacting the new inflow of American citizens living in Mexico has been.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, going back to what services we offer documentation services to our nationals, over 30 different documentation services. And this is relevant to U.S. authorities, especially because we get to identify people who otherwise would not be identifiable. So we work with them. We have seen many, many different families coming to the consulate saying we don't have anything to prove who we are. We don't have anything to prove whom our children are. So we engage in interviews, we go back to databases in Mexico, we put the pieces of the puzzle together to prove their identities, and then issue documents. And we have a pretty wide variety of documents we issue. We do notary public, civil registry. After the election, the presidential election back in November, we have seen a very important increase in the demand of people who are wanting to register their children as Mexican nationals. Because if you're a Mexican national yourself and you have children here in the U.S., your children are entitled to the Mexican nationality. So that is like the natural reaction from many Mexican or Mexican-American people when things get, tense. They tend to want to have some safety and to, claim the right of the Mexican nationality for their children. So that is documentation is pretty wide. We do legal and protection affairs. We teach our nationals on what the law is, how to follow the law in the best way possible, and which their rights are. And we also have community affairs programs, preventive health, education in general. We teach them on how to navigate the educational system in the U.S. in the best way possible. We teach them financial education. For example, we really want them to pay their taxes. They do actually pay taxes already, which are retained in their pay stubs, even if they are undocumented. Most of the times they do pay taxes, income taxes, not only consumption or property taxes, but also income taxes. But they don't file their taxes. And we want them to do that, to have proof that they are actually paying taxes. So those are educational programs that we have, and we have promotion.
I think your comment about the taxes is so important, because one of the myths about immigrants is that they don't pay taxes, right? That sure, they might pay sales taxes or other consumption taxes, but and so I think that's important to see that actually not only are many of them already paying those income taxes, but you're working with them to help show them the advantage of doing that.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things I mentioned in my presentations. It is the system here can be tricky because these migrants have been criminalized lately. They also have very low criminal rates within, especially the undocumented population. I know there have been a couple of very sad cases which have become very visible in the national political arena. But the truth is that the numbers show very clearly that undocumented migrants have very low crime rates. Nevertheless, they have been criminalized. But the IRS would take their taxes. And if they don't have a social security number, they can get an IT number to pay their taxes. So this is a system that collects their taxes, lets them open a bank account so they can get mortgage loans. I know firsthand undocumented Mexican migrants who are business owners, who actually happen to employ U.S. citizens. So the system allows them to do all that, but they won't give them a working permit. And this is, I believe, because the topic, and this is not to blame on any president, to be honest with you. I don't want to be political, of course, sure. But Congress, I believe, has politicized the topic of immigration to the point of inaction and to the point where the system, the political system has not recognized the needs of the economy, of the labor market of the U.S., not formally, because in practice, in practical terms, these migrants come here and they get employed. So the economy is absorbing them. So it's not, I understand, and I tell this every single authority that I meet with, the right, the obligation that the U.S. has to defend its borders. It's only natural to do so. But what is not fair is to have a system that allows all these migrants to come in, who uses them and then criminalizes them. That is not fair. And that's what we worry about.
And I think you're so right. We've had this discussion many times where the real culprit in many of the controversies of the day has been a dysfunctional Congress that simply has not been able to address these issues in a way that makes sense and that conforms to the reality on the ground, right? That we know that people want to come here, they want to work. As you mentioned, not only are they working, but they're creating businesses, they're supporting other families, both American citizens and not, and yet they're in this kind of cloud of uncertainty as far as their status and where they fit in. And it's really, really unfortunate that Congress hasn't figured out a way to craft a law that is conducive to the reality on the ground and fosters a positive relationship between people, right? It seems to constantly want to put people at odds with one another and see us as competitors rather than collaborators.
Yes, when you dehumanize a society, this affects everybody, not only the most vulnerable ones. When you affect a vulnerable group or a minority, that eventually is going to reach everybody. So it is sad. And there's so many things that this political rhetoric is missing. For example, demographics, how relevant it is for the U.S., all big economies in the world, to actually find a way to take immigrants and incorporate them into their societies, their economies in a healthy way, recognizing that demographics show that Americans are not having enough children to continue growing. So you're going to need these migrants. I honestly believe that very soon the largest economies in the world are going to start fighting over these migrants.
You're speaking my language now because we've had this conversation many times. I read a fascinating book about a decade ago that said exactly what you said, that there's going to come a point that because the birth rates worldwide are declining, that countries are going to become competitors for immigrants to come over into their economies rather than trying to prevent them from doing that. And I think you're exactly right. And the quicker we realize that we should be creating a public policy that is conducive for people to come over here, to live the lives they want to live, to be productive members of the communities that they're in, and not just help them, their own families, but to help the communities and the places, the state that they live in, the better off we're going to be in the long run.
No doubt. I agree.
So tell us about this potential impact. We've seen the Trump administration talking about tariffs. They had a big announcement a couple of weeks ago. Oh, we're going to hit Mexico with these tariffs. At one point it was 10%, then 25%. Then a day or two later, well, we're putting a pause because I've done my ranting and raving about tariffs in general, but we were hoping you might be able to tell us potential impact on the Oklahoma economy, because we do have trade. We have people who export things to Mexico and import things from Mexico. If we had a 25% tariff on all of that, those imports, what was the likely outcome on the economic front to Oklahomans from that?
Yeah. Well, in the general sense, first of all, let me say, you probably know this, that Mexico is the main trading partner of the U.S. And now that all these tariffs problem came along, not only against Mexico, but Canada and now Europe, as you all know, Canada has been saying, Canada is a great ally of the U.S. Of course they are. And it's the main buyer of American products. But they cannot say anymore, sorry, I love Canada. I don't have anything against Canada. They cannot say anymore they are the main trading partner of the U.S. because they are not. Mexico is the main trading partner of the U.S. since 2019. And it doesn't really matter that much if we're the main buyer or not, because our economies are so very much intertwined. The chains of production are very wide. More or less in between 40 and 50% of the imports that U.S. does from Mexico are American or have American content. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit irrelevant if you're the main buyer or not when things come and go so many times. So how much this would affect or will affect the American economy? A lot, definitely a lot. And this is going to hurt, of course, Mexico, but also the U.S. It's important to note that NAFTA has been extremely beneficial not only for Mexico, but for the region, including the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. And we need to think in geopolitical terms. The U.S. needs to be competitive against China, against other blocs in the world. And the best shot at it is to continue collaborating in the way that you have been doing with Mexico and Canada, who have, by the way, been such great allies of the U.S. And as a Mexican diplomat, I need to say that sometimes people here in the U.S. do not really value widely enough this collaboration and this alliance with Mexico. But Mexico has been a very loyal ally to the U.S. And I know we are a much smaller economy than the U.S., but it could be a different case. It could be a different situation. It's not all about money. It's sovereignty matters, pride, the nationality matters. So getting into a fight with Mexico, provoking negative feelings within the Mexican population against the U.S. would not benefit anybody. Mexico is to the south of the U.S. We have a shared super long border, and only for security reasons, Mexico is a vital ally to the U.S., not only being the main trading partner, but also for security and natural resources. So many different reasons that I could point out where Mexico is really a relevant ally to the U.S. We want to continue collaborating. I don't understand what is the benefit to the U.S. on trying to, deepen this rhetoric against Mexico within the U.S. media. It's not beneficial for anybody. The U.S. needs allies.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. NAFTA, you brought up one of my early Dr. Stacy ranting sweet spots whenever I was child, people would rant about NAFTA. And it's interesting, right? A lot of folks blame Bill Clinton for NAFTA, right? Because it was implemented under Bill Clinton. But of course, the idea of free trade goes back to Reagan, right? I mean, they opened the free trade between Canada and the United States under Ronald Reagan. And then, of course, H.W. Bush, who I lovingly refer to as Daddy Bush, of course, expands it and writes NAFTA, right? It goes into implementation, like I said, under Clinton. But it was a H.W. Bush concept. And as you so eloquently said, it's been incredibly beneficial for the last 30 years, so much so that most Americans don't recognize how beneficial it has been because their jeans are not $300 a piece, or their shoes, or all the other items that we've come to take for granted. It's really insane to see the backlash now, I think, on social media where people are realizing, oh my God, just the most basic thing, guacamole, or what people immediately go to. It's crazy to see how quickly they're making that connection between what I pay and this product that comes from China, Canada, Mexico, et cetera.
Yes, and it's not only, the American economy needs to continue being competitive, but it's not only that, it's also about the influence that the US has in the global arena. Because, for example, the dollar, and I have a couple of comments here that I would like to share with you. This strong commercial relationship could be harmed if a tariff war were to occur within the North American region. Undoubtedly, in the short term, a trade war would have a greater impact on the Mexican economy than on that of the US, as Mexico has a much smaller economy and is highly dependent on its economic and commercial interaction with the US. However, Mexico is a young country with well-established manufacturing supply chains and a geographical position that would allow it to expand trade with Asia, Europe, and South America. Additionally, Mexico has a strong democracy and broad popular support for our president to take the necessary measures to move forward. On the other hand, the medium and long-term effects would be much broader and could eventually have a significant impact on the US as well. For example, the current threat of tariffs within the framework of a regional trade agreement, because we do have a trade agreement that was negotiated and approved by all three North American countries, sends a strong message, not only to Mexico and Canada, but also to the rest of the world about the reliability of the US as a trade partner. This could contribute to US isolationism, a significant expansion of global trade beyond its influence, and the potential weakening of the dollar as the dominant global exchange currency. If the US dollar were to lose its status as the world's primary currency, the national debt could spiral out of control. I believe this is extremely relevant. You were able, as a nation, to do what you did during COVID, only because you have the dollar. Nobody was able to print. I'm saying this figuratively.
You're right.
To print that much money and to put money into the pockets of families and save all these, episodes of the COVID the way you did. And that's why your economy came roaring back. People didn't want to go back to work. And that's why you took so many migrants. The border was so weak. Homeland Security, there was a point, and I have the numbers, where Mexico had double the agents looking after immigration affairs than the US did on the southern border. You had like 18,000, we had almost 40,000. We are 20 times smaller as an economy. So Homeland Security has been underfunded for many, many years. Because again, going back to the politicization of the topic of immigration. So your border was weak. Your economy had a huge incentive for these migrants to come. And they began coming from all over the world. One of the things that surprised me the most was to see so many Chinese citizens taking the trip from China to try to get to the US, through Mexico, of course, as everybody. And I am saying that I was surprised because China is the second largest economy in the world. So I am sure there's options and there's alternatives in China. Nevertheless, they took the decision to take the trip. It's very expensive, a very expensive and risky trip, just to try to get into the US because they knew they were going to be employed. They had the guarantee. So the economy employs all these migrants. And let me tell you, for Mexico, it was a challenge to see all these flows of new migrants coming through our territory. Around 80% of the migrants who came into the US undocumented during the last 3-4 years were not Mexican. Almost 80% were not Mexican. Mexico does not have the resources that the US has. Nevertheless, many people in the US claims that Mexico should be stopping these migrants. We are not Homeland Security. We are not. I mean, it is like if we were not entitled to have our own policies and our own interests, only those of the US. And again, we want to be a good partner. You are very relevant for us, but Mexico cannot take the responsibility of things the US has, should be doing.
Sure. You hit on something that, again, is very close to my heart. I teach comparative politics, so BRICS is something that I pay a lot of attention to: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The expansion of this group has been exceptional in the last few years to include African countries, even Eastern European countries. And so I pay a very close attention to the influence that not necessarily adversaries, but definitely folks or countries who would like to eschew the dollar from international trade.
They've been trying really hard.
Yes, ma'am. And so it absolutely perks my attention whenever the United States is banding about these threats with allies, whenever we recognize that there are formidable organizations that are alternatives to the United States and to the Western sort of liberal democratic order.
Yeah, China and Russia have been trying really hard to weaken the dollar as the exchange coin for excellence. And let's see what just happened with Panama. The American government is pressing Panama to stay away from China, from the Silk Road policy, right? So China is on your backyard. So if you were to, this is not an official position at all. This is only my personal opinion, and I wouldn't like Mexico and the US to get into a fight, not at all. The US is super important for Mexico. But what if there was a fight? Mexico would have to look for alternatives. Right. So we are right there. I mean, it doesn't really make that much sense to me when, again, Mexico has been such a loyal ally. So, but tariffs, I don't believe that tariffs are bad all the time. Sometimes they make sense when there's a partner that is breaking the rules. If you have a negotiated agreement and that partner is not following the rules, tariffs may make sense if they are, strategic and they respond to a certain situation. If you are using them as a negotiation tool to put pressure within, again, a negotiated framework that you are not respecting, many things are going to happen and people are going to lose trust. And that also has a cost. I hope really that the US and Mexico find a way to keep on going as partners. If there are certain points or parts in the economy that worry the US, the Mexican president has said so. We can sit down and negotiate and talk about it. Actually, our president, Claudia Sheinbaum, whom is the first female president in our history, we're very proud of that. She just launched a series of not reforms, but policies, economic policy to try to strengthen the economy in Mexico. And one of them is to try to start producing goods in Mexico that we import from China. Because, of course, Mexico understands that there is that interest here in the US. And China is a gigantic competitor. I was listening to a podcast at the New York Times the other day where they were presenting numbers about how even though the tariffs that the first Trump administration and then Biden's administration kept against China, even though that their trade has been growing at a rate of 20% as opposed to 3% for the rest of the world. So their trade dominance is overwhelming. And I don't know if I should use this word, but it is actually a risk for the other economies in the world, because the way they compete is because they've had a lot of cheap labor, not that so cheap anymore, but they are an authoritarian system. So they can make more effective, more efficient decisions regarding their economy and what they want to, for example, cars, electric cars. They made decisions 5-7 years ago, and they implemented them because they had the resources and they can move all the machinery inside of their economy. And now they are super effective, super competitive, and they are a risk for our industries. So Mexico as an ally, as a partner, is in practical terms recognizing this, and we're trying to compensate.
Mitigate.
Yes.
You kind of touched on this, but who pays for tariffs imposed on U.S. imports? And what are the benefits or risks of imposing tariffs? You kind of mentioned the need to impose policies and make sure good behavior is happening, but what else?
Yeah, we've heard many times recently that, of course, the consumer ends up paying for tariffs. But not necessarily so, because at the beginning they do. What happens in the end, I believe, is that the trade actually stops. In the case of Mexico and the US and Canada, it would not only be the trade of a certain good, but the production chain. Because again, everything is intertwined, or a lot of goods are produced in an intertwined way within our region. So that would have like a double or triple effect in our economies, because trade is a win-win situation. It's not like you lose. You cannot measure the benefits of trade as a how do you say, plano. It has different perspectives, and you need to understand all the implications of the trade flow and all the benefits, how it impacts different sectors of the economy in the process in the trading process. So they say in the beginning, the consumer would pay for tariffs, but eventually I believe that if the good became too expensive or unaffordable for the consumer, what would happen is that the trade would stop, the exchange would stop, and that would have an impact in the economy. For example, if you have a truck that moves all these goods, the truck company would be impacted. If the goods come to the supermarket would be impacted because they would be selling less goods, they would be having less clients. So it's not only going to be the impact between the goods, the person or the company that is selling the good, and the buyer. There's a chain in the middle of intermediaries, and everybody would be affected.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right in that the downstream effects of this approach. And this is what I always try to encourage people to talk about and understand. You're not talking about governments hurting one another. You're talking about people. At the end of the day, people are getting hurt by these kinds of policies. The truck driver, the farmer, the laborer, all of these people, because when that ability to trade stops, jobs are lost. People have less access to choices for consumer items that they might want, and the general standard of living is going to be reduced as a result. And so, and if I remember right, at the time NAFTA was agreed upon, it created the largest free trade zone in the world. Is that
is correct?
I think it still is. It's got to be close. I know the European Union has tried to do its own thing, but I still think it's still the largest.
It is, absolutely. It is, and it's such a positive thing, and it's worrisome that the political rhetoric has demonized it. And it has sent the message to the medium American worker that closing this trade is going to help them improve their life standards, which is completely false. It's completely false. So, and again, it's important, I believe, for America to realize that more now than ever before, for any nation, it would be easy to start trading with somebody else. It would be costly, but it would be possible because communications are much easier now. It's very easy to move goods.
It's a lot easier now than it was in the 1990s or 1980s, right?
China is not that far away anymore. And there's a huge market in China, in India, all the Southeast Asia. There's a lot of people there. And Africa, some countries are poor and underdeveloped, but there's a lot of people in Africa and they're still growing. So there's opportunities somewhere else. It doesn't make sense. So mistreating your allies doesn't really make sense.
No, and it goes back to this kind of zero-sum kind of approach to economics and progress, right? There's some idea that, oh, if they're doing better, that must mean I'm doing worse. And the fact is, the United States does better when Mexico is prospering, when Canada is prospering, when those nations it has close to and it has deep roots and relationships with, when they prosper, the United States prospers as well. And I think, for some reason, a lot of people have a hard time understanding that. And they don't understand that a stronger, more prosperous Mexico and Canada are beneficial to the United States. They're not threats to it.
Absolutely. And we have proven once and again that we are not a threat. Actually, before COVID, the inflow of Mexican migrants to the U.S. was in the negative numbers. It was -1. More people were going back to Mexico than those who were moving here to the U.S. COVID changed that a little bit. Now we were at 1% before the change of administration because that has plummeted. But before that, we were at 1%, again, only because of the incentives. The economy was so strong. It has such a huge thirst for these workers that they began coming. They began coming, claiming asylum. When they were not asylum, their profile didn't fit that. But not because they are bad people, but because they were being coached by these human trafficking networks or migrant trafficking networks. They would go to their localities in Mexico, knock on their doors, and offer them to bring them to the U.S. We had countless cases of families telling us this story here. And they would tell them it's $10,000 per person. People would say, no, I don't have that kind of money. I am okay here. We can take your house, sell your house to us, and we'll take you to the U.S. So people would give out their houses. They would be brought to the border, coached on what to say to the Homeland Security officer. The Homeland Security officer would just, okay, you're an asylum seeker. Here's this paper with your picture on it. And then this network would take them to different cities, Tulsa, one of them, and then take them to attorneys who are established here. And then they would, because there is such a long backlog in the immigration courts in the U.S., they would get a court hearing in 2-3 years' time. And while the court hearing took place, they would get a working permit. So people who were living in Mexico, they didn't have any plans to come here because the system here, and this is what I keep on telling everybody, these are migrants. They don't, they never probably thought about the idea of coming to the U.S., but the system was pulling them. And the second they get here, they are employed. So that is one kind of, that is the group that came during the last 4 or 5 years after COVID, because of COVID. And we have another large population of people who have been here for 20, 30 years, working really hard. They are probably parents of American children who have paid taxes, contributed without criminal records. But they have not had a chance to find a working permit. The last time there was an immigration reform, as you know, with Reagan, 40 years ago. And the economy has been using them for 40 years. So I jumped from tariffs to the migrants because they're in my heart. But I am not blaming anybody in particular, but when the system has these incentives, unbalances happen.
That's right. That's right.
We love communication that goes both ways, not just you listening to us pontificate. We would love to hear from our audience. If you have comments, suggestions, or would like to contact us about possibly being a guest on the show, please email notmygeneration@raider.rose.edu.
So how do you anticipate things going forward? Do you think the U.S. and its neighbors will be able to resolve this without going into some kind of tariff battle and that kind of thing? And if not, what does that environment look like? If all of a sudden we've decided we don't want free trade anymore, we're going to slap tariffs on each other, what does that end up looking like?
Well, I'm going to be honest, completely honest with you. First of all, I believe this is going to be resolved. I honestly believe that our economies are already too intertwined to actually get into a divorce. We might get into fights, but divorce is not an option. That's what I believe. I actually believe we like each other a lot. I don't believe, and I'm going to say this is a little bit strong, but some people have accused the American voters of the last election of being racists. I don't believe Americans are racists. I believe there are a couple of exceptions within the bunch of millions of Americans. I don't believe so. I understand there has been cultural stress. I understand that the images of the border were very, which were repeated constantly in the media, were very strong. I wish people would understand that the border between Mexico and the U.S. is a very rich border that sees this exchange, which is the richest trade exchange in the world. We have a community of 30 million people living at the border who cross the border constantly. It's a beautiful place, actually, with natural resources, great towns. So the border is not what they present in the media, but I understand. I understand the cultural stress, and I understand the reaction to the fact that people come here without papers. I understand that. But I am sure positive that eventually people are going to see that the systems are going to have to find a way to continue speaking to each other. I am positive about that. But what could happen, and this is only, I am only fantasizing because I am sure this is not going to happen. But if Mexico and the US got into a fight, I believe that Mexico would have to look for different allies, and who would be the most interested one to get engaged with Mexico? Of course, China. Right. So, for example, when people talk about bombing Mexico, they did this before, and now they are beginning to talk about drones to go and bomb the cartels in Mexico. First of all, that wouldn't solve anything. Bombing a cartel, killing what? 2-3 drug dealers is not going to solve anything. That would, though, have a collateral effect in Mexican public opinion toward the U.S. Today, the U.S. is very popular in Mexico. Mexicans have in our majority, we have a pretty positive opinion of the U.S. Nevertheless, there are recent attacks, which are not fair, but okay. But if you began bombing us, I believe that would change. And I was making the point about our president. She's very popular. Yes. For the first time in our modern history, she has control of Congress. Well, not her, but her political party of Congress. And there's coming a judicial reform in Mexico, which is very significant. So the political party won the election overwhelmingly. And they do have a lot of power because the people gave it to them. And she was popular, but after the attacks and the tariffs episode, she became even more popular. She's at 75%. So people know that there's limits. And don't miss the point that because Mexico is not as rich as the US, money is not necessarily going to matter that much to Mexico as it does matter to the US. So hopefully that is never going to happen. But I said that at the beginning, sovereignty does matter to anyone. So don't think of Mexico as a country that is not going to defend its sovereignty, its pride, its nationality. We are entitled to do that, just like you are. We're all countries, like individuals, and every country should have the same rights. We should all be entitled to have interests and to protect those interests. And it is very happy. It's a happy situation that both our interests have been compatible. They continue to be compatible. Why look for trouble? And now going back for the organized crime and drug cartels, which is a pest. It's a problem for Mexico mainly. Don't lose sight, please, that who created this demand for drugs was the US, not Mexico. There is a movie called Benny's Back with Julia Roberts. I hope you can see it. Have you seen it? She's the mother of a teenage boy who became an addict of oxycodone when he was 13 years old because he broke his elbow. She took him to the pediatrician, and the pediatrician prescribed oxycodone to him. And this happened for 10 years in the US. Doctors were prescribing oxycodone, and big pharmacies, chains were selling them. There's suits from attorneys general from red states, not blue states, against big pharma in the US because they knew they were selling these prescriptions who were highly, so addictive. So we didn't create the demand. We don't create the components. They are produced mainly in China and India, and they are brought into Mexico. And yes, because there's corruption, sadly, that allows all these products to come into the system, and then they get transformed into these small pills of fentanyl throughout hundreds, if not thousands, of labs, which are like, home labs, like small labs. So trying to bomb these labs would be impossible without affecting the Mexican population. Finding them would be impossible. And the second you bomb them, 2 days after that, you're going to have a new lab because they're like very easy to set up. And what happens when these pills are, put together? 80%, in between 80 and 85% of these pills are imported into the US by US citizens. The Cato Institute and Homeland Security have documented this. So who crosses the fentanyl pills? Not El Chapo and his cousins. US citizens, mainly, because there is a market and there's a business. Fentanyl costs 1,000 times less in Sinaloa than in New York City. So the profit is gigantic. And then once the pills are brought into the US, who distributes all these pills throughout the enormous American territory? The US only mainland without Alaska and Hawaii is 4 times bigger than Mexico. So who's doing all this, selling throughout the streets in the US? And then the most important, relevant part, I believe, is who money launders the gains. Because those gains are money laundered through the American financial system, not through the Mexican financial system. So this is a binational problem. To say it is Mexico to blame is not only not fair, but it's not going to solve anything. So bombing Mexico to try to get rid of this problem is not going to solve it. It's only going to make things worse. So there's we need to work together on this. And actually, President Trump just said today or yesterday that when he had the last conversation with President Sheinbaum from Mexico, she shared with him, because he asked her, why do you have such low consumption of drugs? She said, because we have very strong family values. And he said, we have strong family values as well. She said, well, and we also have a campaign. We have a lot of advertisements and a campaign against the consumption of drugs in Mexico, which is true. And he was very much interested. And if you have you wondered where's the national campaign here in the US? You keep on saying that's a huge problem for your country, which is, it is, but where's the national campaign against consumption? So something doesn't click. It's easier always to blame everything on Mexico. Why is Mexico letting all these migrants come in? Why is Mexico letting all these drugs come in? Because you are a huge market. And as long as such a powerful, rich market consumes all these drugs are going to keep on flowing in. Really, even if Mexico was to stop it, they would find a way. They would find a way to use the space or the seas, or Canada, because Canada also says fentanyl doesn't come through our border. Okay, because you're to the north of the U.S. If you were to the south, it would come through it's impossible to stop them. And also because there's a lot of American partners into this trade. So it's not a one-way thing. It's a market. So my point here is it's more relevant than ever before for us to collaborate and to work together to try to tackle, to try to face these challenges.
Yeah, fabulous. Is there anything lingering that you didn't say that you would like to say?
I think it is important also to mention that we opened our doors in 2023 mainly because the Governor Stitt, did work very hard for us to exist. There are several states in the U.S. who would like to have a consulate of Mexico because they know we have services that complement the services that any other U.S. agency could provide to this community. This morning, for example, we met with the sheriff of Canadian County. They do have a 287G collaboration with ICE to deport undocumented people who comes into their jail. So people would think, why was the Consulate of Mexico meeting with them? Well, because we understand they are trying to do their job. And whenever they detain a Mexican national, there are services we can provide. And there's legal assistance we can provide. Beginning with, if they need to identify somebody that they stop, we can help on that. So I was meeting with them. He was very kind, and we had a great meeting. So that's only like the legal part. We can promote trade as well. You were asking me at the beginning of the conversation about trade between Oklahoma and Mexico. It is pretty low. Texas traded with Mexico around $282 billion last year. Oklahoma, only $2 billion. So the potential for our trade to grow is enormous. It's gigantic. One of the things that really surprised me when I moved here was that you don't have international flights. So we are working with Will Rogers and Tulsa International Airport to try to help to inaugurate direct flights from Oklahoma to Mexico. There are so many things we could do. The Greater Oklahoma City Chamber of Commerce visited us last week because they want to host an event at the Mexican Embassy in Washington, D.C. at the end of April. They're going to have a fly-in D.C. They're going to bring some of their members to D.C., and they want to host a reception at the Mexican Embassy. And the Mexican ambassador has already confirmed his participation. He's going to give some words, a presentation, etc. So that's the kind of things we can do as a consulate to try to promote a better relationship between Oklahoma and Mexico. And most of all, we want to promote a better understanding in Mexico of what Oklahoma is, the richness of Oklahoma, its people, and the other way around. We want Oklahoma to understand Mexico better. So that's the work we're doing.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your gracious time to talk about the consulate here, your work. I think that's fantastic. And kudos to Governor Stitt for pushing to try to get your organization here and the work that you do. I think that's, but as you said, that's beneficial for not only the people of Mexico, but it's beneficial for the people of Oklahoma as well. And we're going to wrap up here. And we want to remind everybody that
democracy is not a spectator sport. See you next time.
Hey everyone, this this is Deborah, the resident Gen Z member of the Not My Generation podcast family. Not My Generation is produced in the Possibilities Inc. studio. This episode was produced by Santiago Ramones. It was edited by Santiago Ramones. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. Send a voice memo to notmygeneration@raider.rose.edu and you could hear your voice on an upcoming episode. If you liked today's episode, please consider giving us a 5-star rating and sharing the podcast with others. You can check out previous episodes on any podcast app and on our podcast website at notmygeneration.captivate.fm, where we also provide our show notes. And remember, you can follow Not My Generation on X, formerly known as Twitter, at NMG Podcast, and on Facebook at Not My Generation Podcast. We look forward to interacting with you soon.